And it was originally at the suggestion of one of a Zoroastrian in America who sent me a letter, remember, saying you should form this group years ago. And we talked about it and we said, let's do it, and eventually, and I met him, I think, at the Congress in New York, and thanked him in person. So it's been wonderful. We've had very, very high quality events over the years, and thanks for your support.
I think currently you're being very modest. Two good things happened. In 2001, you set up the WZCC.
Yes.
And then 2006, Tony Blair sent you to the House of Lords. And 2013, you set up the ZAPG.
Yes.
No need to give credit to anyone in North America. This is a homegrown idea.
Thank you very much, Dora. Thank you. And is Shanaz engineer here?
Yes, she's very
So when the World Zoroastrian Chamber of Commerce, of which I was privileged to be the founding chair, Shanaz took over from me and has been a stalwart in his current chair, and you're going to be hosting the annual Congress here in July.
Yes.
And we're going to be holding one of the events here in
On the
Parliament.
27th of July.
27th of July.
And Karan, I think the two of our youth leaders will also be here. They've not reached yet. Who will be conducting the youth congress?
The Youth Congress is also taking place in July. Yes. Yes. And Cyrus
We want
Poonawalla.
to make that announcement after the youth are here.
Okay, let's wait for it. Maybe will you remind me at the end to make that?
Sure.
Okay, can I just check the recordings are all on now? Yes? Charles, is that on?
It's on, it's on.
Okay, Charles is doing work experience with me. He was at Eton and now at Brown University. Finished his second year, around halfway through his studies in America. Right, now we are going to formally start the lecture. Karishma, can you hear us? Can you see us and hear us clearly? Yeah, there's something you need to just click on here, I think.
Yes, I've got it. The meeting is being recorded.
Can you just press OK?
Jeez, technical issues.
We're recording the lecture.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Krishna, and your mother. Regards to you. Right. It's now my great, great privilege to introduce someone who has become a very close friend of mine, and one of the individuals I've had the privilege of not only meeting, but who I respect enormously. He gave a lecture yesterday at SOAS, which was, I think quite a few of us were present, which was absolutely brilliant. It was 1 hour, he never uses any notes, as you will see, on the history of the Sasanians. And the whole Sasanian Empire over centuries, in detail, with the people, the dates, the incidents. It was absolutely fascinating. But today, he is going to lecture about the history of Parliament. What I can guarantee, knowing him, that we parliamentarians here are going to learn a lot that we didn't know about our own Parliament. So I'm really looking forward to it. But before that, Justice Ranjanaraman is one of the most famous, respected, distinguished lawyers in India. His father, Fali Nariman, is a legend and was a minister, was a member of the Rajya Sabha, a member of the House of Lords in India, and a wonderful, wonderful human being, again, who I have the privilege of knowing. And son has followed in his father's footsteps and excelled in his own way, made his own mark, was Solicitor General of India, was a Supreme Court judge, but not just a Supreme Court judge. He has been on the bench with some of the most transformational judgments in recent history, including the right to privacy, including many, many other things I could go into, homosexuality, many rulings that have changed the law in India in a major way. He is an ordained priest, and of course, for those with the non-Parsis, you can't become a Zoroastrian priest unless you're born into a priestly family. So you can be born into a priestly family, but you can't become a priest unless you go through a very rigorous training to become a priest, which he has done. And not only that, he is a very eminent theologian and has written books on Zoroastrianism theology in general. Apart from that, he is an expert in classical music. Of the experts that I know in the world, probably one of the most authoritative experts in classical music. So you've got a polymath here, a true polymath and a genius. So over to you, Justice Nyland. Please, if you'd like to stand and speak.
Thank you, Karan. Honorable members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. The first thing that strikes you when you come to this grand building is the two statues outside. I wonder if all of you noticed them. One happens to be of an absolute king, Richard Coeur de Lion, Richard I. And the other happens to be of Oliver Cromwell. Now, Richard Coeur de Lion hardly ruled. He was hardly in this kingdom for 6 months of his 10-year rule. He happened to be on crusade most of the time. And I found out why his statue was put here. It has nothing to do with Parliament. It's interesting to note that it was made in the 19th century by some Italian artist who ultimately got his way with some committee to see that the statue gained prominence in front of the Houses of Parliament. So far as Cromwell is concerned, Cromwell is the one man who ruled without the king being in Parliament. More of that later. Now, when we speak of Parliament as an institution in this country, you will find that it is intertwined entirely with English history from 1066 on. So it is important first to give you a brief summary of who the kings were and what the dynasties were. Now, you begin in 1066 with William the Conqueror, as all of you know. And he set up what was called the Norman dynasty, if I may call it that. They were all French-speaking kings. And that dynasty was very long-lived because it continued beyond the Plantagenet dynasty, which is the next one, called Plantagenet only because Henry II was descended from one of the daughters instead of one of the male heirs. But it was essentially the same bloodline. And that continued all the way till the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. So we have a very, very long-lived first dynasty. And what he did so far as the law is concerned and so far as Parliament is concerned is one part of the story. After 1485, we have the next important dynasty. And at this point, it's important to remember that the English have never ruled the English. It is only the French who started first as Norman, the Welsh who followed, because the Tudor dynasty is Welsh, ending with the great Elizabeth I. Then the Scots, and the Scots produce the most delightful detail as to how Parliament ultimately evolved. And finally, the Hanoverian dynasty, which continues today, which is German. Now, when we start with 1066 and William the Conqueror, William was asked as to whether he would want to bring his code of laws from France with him and impose them on the English. And fortunately, he was wise enough to say no. So we find that it is the old Anglo-Saxon codes which were prevalent at his time, which then became the law. And he ruled, of course, as you know, till 1087. Then his son William Rufus comes in. He has a short rule. And after him, his brother Henry I comes in, who has a very long rule, 1100 to 1135. And Henry I's rule is important only in this, that in 1100, as he became a king, he came out with something of a Magna Carta of his own. Because that charter is really the first English Magna Carta, so to speak, because it spoke of certain liberties of the nobles, if not the people themselves. And this continues into the reign of the next king, who was Stephen, who happened to be the conqueror's daughter's son, grandson. And finally, we come to that extremely powerful King Henry II. Now, Henry II is of Archbishop Becket fame, as all of you know. And Henry II is important in that at his time, Parliament was spoken of as a great council. It consisted only of clergy, bishops, and nobles. And right at the end of his reign, when the Third Crusade was going on, he extracted what was called the Saladin tithe. Now, Saladin was the great conqueror who happened to take back Jerusalem at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. And because he took back Jerusalem, there was a crisis in Christendom. And the crisis had to be solved by sending troops. Now, how do you send troops? You've got to raise funds. And how do you raise funds? You call a parliament. So, he called what was the Great Council at that time and raised funds in order to combat Saladin. And died shortly after, in 1189, which is when statue number 1 takes over, Richard the Lionheart. And Richard the Lionheart, as I told you, was away on crusade most of the time and ruled through his mother, his very powerful mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. And his reign ended in about 1199. And then starts the reign with which we are concerned. That is of his brother, John Lackland, who was called Lackland because his father couldn't leave him any land. All lands having been distributed between the first 3 sons. But anyway, John Lackland took over as Richard had no issue, or no legitimate issue. And John then ruled for a period of 16 years, in which you have the most famous document of all, Magna Carta, which is a document of 1215. Now, Magna Carta is known for its clauses 39, 40, which are the great liberty clauses. But where Parliament is concerned, what is important is clause 12. Because clause 12 lays down, for the first time, that you cannot tax without some kind of common approval. And this system, therefore, of taxation without the common acceptance was really traceable only to Magna Carta and plays a great role in the formation of Parliament as we get along. Now, Magna Carta was annulled almost immediately by an extremely powerful pope, who was called Pope Innocent III. Despite which, when John died the next year, we have a long reign of his son Henry III. Now, Henry III becomes king at age 9. Henry III has a lot to do with this particular building. He believed strongly that Edward the Confessor was a saint. And as a result, because Westminster was his creation, he wished to enhance it and make it look as beautiful as possible. So a lot of the handiwork here is done by this monarch. As I said, he had a very long reign. He went on till 1272. And where Parliament, 2 or 3 important things happened. In 1258, we have Parliament being called Parliament for the first time. It's a French word, Parlement, which only means to speak. The fact that persons congregate together and happen to speak is what Parliament is all about, so that you come to a collective decision. And an important Parliament called at Oxford in 1258 laid down that every Parliament should be called at least thrice a year. That was the first important step. At that time, remember, Parliament consisted only of nobles and clergy. Commons come in a few years later because his brother-in-law Simon de Montfort had a rebellion. And Simon de Montfort also ruled through a parliament because he took over until he was killed at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. And the 2-year rule of 1263 and 1264 were important because for the first time, you had commons represented in parliament, the common people. So Simon de Montfort's parliament becomes important because the genesis of this house is in that parliament. Then this great king dies in 1272. Meanwhile, his son Edward I, who is extremely important in English history, not only as Hammer of the Scots, he is known as the Hammer of the Scots, not only for beginning with the title of the Prince of Wales, because his son was the very first Prince of Wales, but also because he nurtured Parliament as an institution. Now, when his father died in 1272, he was away on a crusade, and the crusade was an inconclusive one. Nothing much happened. Jerusalem wasn't taken. And he took about 2 years to come back from Sicily before he got coronated here in 1274. But as soon as he came back, in 1275, one of the first things he did was, he had what was called the Statutes of Westminster, which are extremely important from the point of view of the law, because everything that was Anglo-Saxon law was codified by Parliament and put into statute form for the first time. And some of these statutes have lasted even till today. The other great thing he did was that in 1297, he reissued Magna Carta. So, Parliament now becomes established as an institution, and he saw to it that it was convened at least twice a year. Of course, it is the warrior kings who needed Parliament the most, for the reason that taxation could not easily be obtained without Parliament's consent. So the basis for Parliament existing here was really that it is important to call a Parliament every time you need to tax people, because only then you get their consent. Otherwise, you might have a rebellion on your hands. Now, Edward I was a very powerful king. Died, and by the way, you'll find all these places in London, King's Cross being one of them, are all places where, and there are 12 of them, where his most beloved queen, Eleanor of Castile, was laid, because she died long before him. And at the 12 places she was laid before she was buried. And they were all now Charing Cross is one, King's Cross is another. And finally, when this king died, his 14th child, because she gave birth to 16 children, became King Edward II. And King Edward II was a weak monarch. Being a weak monarch, he is not somebody who impresses us in history, except for the fact that he had the most horrendous death. Within 20 years, everybody conspired to have him killed. He had favorites, he had Piers Gaveston, etc., who were hated, who were killed before him. But in Berkeley Castle, apparently, where he was imprisoned, you had a hot rod pushed into his anus to destroy him, so that ultimately there would be no mark found on the dead body. And his shrieks apparently could be heard all over the countryside. But so far as Parliament is concerned, what is important is that Parliament in 1327 decreed that he should abdicate. Very important. So it was Parliament's decree that was followed. Because who else could otherwise dictate that a king should abdicate and abdicate in favor of his son? And then comes another very, very powerful king, Edward III. And Edward III had this huge run-in in France, which started the 100 Years' War. It's called the 100 Years' War because it went on for some 115 years. And because Edward III needed money constantly, he had to call Parliament constantly. Now in Edward III's reign, two very important things happened. In 1341, Commons separated from the Lords. So the actual House of Commons has its origin at that point of time. You did not have one parliament. Now you had two houses. And this particular house felt emboldened enough to say now by statute in 1362 that henceforth there can, as a matter of law, be no taxation without Parliament's consent. These two very important things were laid down way back in Edward III's time. Edward III died, and then begins the struggle after his grandson takes over and dies, Richard II. The struggle between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, the Wars of the Roses, which all of you have heard of. Henry IV, the first Lancastrian king, allowed Parliament now to be petitioned to redress grievances. Important step again in parliamentary power, because the king alone could redress grievances, general grievances. So Parliament now was also entitled to redress grievances in Henry IV's time. In his son Henry V's time, the great victor of Agincourt, you find that Parliament sat as a body, House of Commons, House of Lords, and every bill had to pass through Commons, pass through Lords. That practice began at that time. Finally ratified by the King's signature. And in his son Henry VI's time, people could only vote if they happened to have property worth 40 shillings at that point of time. So the Lancastrians furthered Parliament in these small ways. The Yorkists, Edward IV, the little prince in the tower, Richard III, did nothing very much, nothing much happened in that time. But it's during the Tudors that some very interesting things happen. Henry VII comes and goes, and then the most colorful king in this country, Henry VIII, comes in. He's the one who's known to have had 6 wives. And they went in the following order: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, died. Died in the sense of died naturally. She survived and died natural death. So, we had Henry VIII, and in Henry VIII's time, we had the Speaker now of Parliament as a person who Henry VIII called upon to tell him as to what proceedings were in the House, what was going on in the House. Another interesting thing developed at that time, which was the royal veto, because Henry VIII was an absolute monarch. So he made it clear that whatever you do, ultimately if I veto it, out it goes. But Parliament was very strong at that point of time, and a very interesting incident took place. Parliament in those days could pass legislative judgments. They are called bills of attainder. They are something which written constitutions later outlawed completely. Now, an attainder was moved for the Bishop of Rochester's cook. The Bishop of Rochester's cook happened to have poisoned some members of his household. Now, the moment he poisoned members of the bishop's household, Parliament was asked to pass a retroactive law. And they passed that law. And they said this is a very serious offense, so we have to have something out of the way by way of punishment so that it doesn't happen again. And the punishment chosen was to boil the incumbent in water, in hot water. So the Bishop of Rochester's cook was tried under a retroactive law, found guilty, and ultimately boiled to death. He had to be pulled out twice before he actually died. Now, this kind of attainder found its way into what was called cruel and unusual punishments in the Bill of Rights later, and outlawed. So that shortly after that Bill of Rights, a person called Fenwick's was the last attainder which ever took place, and that was in 1696. So after this reign of Henry VIII, you also had one other interesting thing of the residents of the House of Commons. The House of Commons was housed here until Henry VIII died and his young son took over, Edward VI. And it then moved to a place called St. Stephen's Chapel. And St. Stephen's Chapel continued to be its home right until 1834 when it was burned down. After the Tudors, and the last Tudor, as you know, was Elizabeth the Great, she didn't think much of Parliament, she didn't call Parliament often enough. But before she died in 1601, she addressed Parliament and was apologetic about the fact that she didn't call them often enough and said, in any case, there have been many monarchs before me, there will be many monarchs after me. But there is nobody who loves you as much as I do. After the Tudors go, comes the Stuarts, who were a Scot dynasty, beginning with James I. And this dynasty has a huge amount to do with the development of Parliament today as an institution. You begin with James I, who believed in the fact that he was divinely appointed, what he called the divine right of kings. And he is famously said to have said, what is this grave mistake that my ancestors have fallen into by having a bauble such as this? Anyway, he came and he went. And then came his son Charles I. And when Charles I came in 1625, by 1628, he was presented with what was called a petition of right, a very important document in the history of English constitutional law. Because that petition of right demanded for the first time that no forced loan be taken, loan in inverted commas, by the monarch. And neither will anybody ever be imprisoned without just cause. Charles ignored all this, did not call Parliament for 10 years, until he was forced finally to call it in 1640. And when he called it in 1640, he needed taxes to run government for military purposes, etc. And then went into a head-on collision with Parliament, which led to the famous Civil War. Actually, in 1642, a very interesting thing happened. He barged into the House while it was in session. And he was looking for 5 particular MPs who, according to him, were ringleaders of a group that were opposing. The MPs had been forewarned, so they had disappeared. So he looks around and he asks the speaker, a man called Lenthal, where are these 5 gentlemen by name? So the speaker gave a very famous answer. The answer was, I do not have eyes to see, nor do I have tongue to speak anything except as instructed by members of this House, and sat down. The result was, Charles walked out, and when Charles walked out and these people were on the run, the Civil War started. First battle was the Battle of Edgehill in 1642 itself. And it was Cromwell at this point of time, who as a general, got together Parliament's armies as against the King's forces, which were largely mercenary. And in battle after battle, ending with the Battle of Naseby in 1645, the King got defeated. And ultimately had to pay the price with his head. Because on 30th January 1649, King Charles was actually beheaded. 30th January, as you know, is quite a date in history. Because it's also our great Mahatma Gandhi's assassination day. So, it's also the day, as a matter of fact, when Hitler came to power. 30th January 33. So, when Charles lost his head, Parliament was then convened to rule the country without a king. Cromwell retired for a short while, came back to find things were worse than under the king, famously dissolved parliament by just the force of his appearance, of his personality, and then ruled through an elected parliament without a king. Incidentally, that elected parliament was only the Commons, because the House of Lords got abolished in Cromwell's time. That was for a very short period because he died in 1658. And shortly after, because his son couldn't sustain what he had done, Charles II was called back and coronated in 1660 and had to rule with a parliament again. Again had the same Stuart difficulties with parliament. In the last 4 years of his reign till he died in 1684, he didn't call parliament. And as luck would have it, his Catholic brother who took over after it, James II, then produced a boy. He had already produced 2 girls who were Protestant, who became queens. But the moment he produced a boy who was Catholic, the entire country rose in what was called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. That revolution was again something amazing because it was the only revolution in history where a monarch was actually thrown out without a shot being fired. James II just ran away. And his son-in-law, William III, who was Dutch, the only Dutch monarch of this country, who was married to his Protestant daughter Mary, then ruled as William and Mary. And William and Mary's time is extremely important so far as Parliament is concerned, because for the first time you had a Bill of Rights in 1689. And that Bill of Rights made it clear that number one, there was to be no cruel and unusual punishment. You could not have the Bishop of Rochester's cook boiled in water, for example. It also decreed that there would be no excessive fines, no excessive bails. And it laid down, and most important, of course, that there would be free speech in Parliament, that is, unhindered or uninterrupted by a king. Actually, the aftermath of Charles II, or Charles I, sorry, having stormed Parliament, is a very curious one. Because 2 things happened. One was a man carrying a black rod, which institution continues till today, now comes and actually stands at the opening of Parliament where the monarch is to be taken in. And before the monarch is taken in, the doors of the Commons are slammed shut in Black Rod's face because of what Charles I had done. And Black Rod then has to knock the door thrice for it to open, signifying that it could only open if the Commons wanted it to open and not otherwise. Correspondingly, a member of Parliament was kept at Buckingham Palace. I don't know whether this practice continues even today. Was kept at hostage at Buckingham Palace to ensure the king's safe return. So these are the interesting little things that the English are so good at. And the tradition which was laid down then continues, as they say, even today. So William and Mary are a very important time in the history of Parliament. Also, an Act of Settlement was passed by Parliament in 1701, just before William died. And that Act of Settlement made it clear now, as a matter of law, that no Catholic shall ever become a monarch of this country. It can only be Protestants. It also did something very important for the judiciary, because judges were at the king's pleasure in those days. For the first time now, it laid down that judges would have a fixed tenure and were removable if they were not on good behavior. William and Mary come and they go, and then Queen Anne, the last of the Stuarts, reigns before the Georges come. And in her time, where Parliament in 1707, you now become the United Kingdom because there is a fusion with Scotland. So that the Scots Parliament and the English Parliament become one. Queen Anne now dies in 1707, and George I from Hanover is brought. Incidentally, George I was a man who didn't speak a word of English. Couldn't speak a word of English. Why was he brought? He was brought only because he was Protestant. There was the old pretender and the young pretender still living. That is the son of James II and the grandson, and Bonnie Prince Charlie. But this man was brought even though he happened to be from Elizabeth of Bohemia, who was James I's daughter, who had married a German prince, and her daughter Sophie, who had again married some other German prince. So he was almost completely German by blood. But anyway, he was the only person who could be fished out, and he was fished out and he became George I. Now, because George I couldn't speak English and because George I preferred to be in Hanover than to be here, Parliament as an institution got into its own. For one, you had the first de facto Prime Minister here, Robert Walpole. And this principle of a Prime Minister being responsible to Parliament instead of the King began at the time of George I. Very important therefore. After George I, you had George II, you had George III, you had Reform Acts. 1832 was a major Reform Act going in the direction of universal adult suffrage, which this country only got finally in 1928, when the Equal Suffragette Act was passed, allowing women who were above 21 years to be voters. In the 20th century, something where the House of Lords took place, which rendered that body largely toothless. Because what happened was, in 1911 an act was passed and ratified by the Commons, saying that the House of Lords could henceforth only delay legislation. It couldn't veto legislation, and delay it by 2 years. Those 2 years became 1 year in 1949. So that today, the House of Lords can sit on something for 1 year, but then after that 1 year it becomes law, whether it likes it or not. Something very different from our Rajya Sabha. Another very important thing took place in the last century, and that is England joining the EU, because the moment it joined the European Union in the 1970s, what happened was, for the first time, Parliament's sovereignty got impacted. A parliamentary law could now be struck down by a court, which it could not earlier, on the ground that it did not conform to a higher law, that is the EU law. And this position obtained until 2020, very recently, when the Withdrawal Act was passed. And when the Withdrawal Act was passed, Parliament stated that it continued to be sovereign. It used the word sovereign. There's been a lot of debate on what the expression sovereignty means. If it means that there's nobody above you, it's very difficult to say you are sovereign. Because the obvious principle of democracy, rule of law, etc. are above everybody. The sovereign indeed is bound by them. The king is bound by them. In fact, in an interesting House of Lords judgment in 2005, there were dicta from various House of Lords members, each of whom said that for various reasons, it's very difficult now to say that Parliament is sovereign. Tom Bingham didn't agree. Written a beautiful book called The Rule of Law. And he said, Parliament is always sovereign, has always been sovereign. And if at all it said that the EU law is something above it, it is because it said that it's above it. At any point of time, it may take it away. as it is declaratory now. So, ultimately, we find today that the king in parliament has changed drastically through the centuries. You had the king as the vestige of all power in the old days. You had Magna Carta, which made a small dent in it, and which made the House of Lords share some little part of that power. House of Lords consisting, as it consists today, of bishops and peers. I'm told that today there are some 26 bishops, of whom the archbishops of 5 cities have to be represented. That is of Canterbury, of London, of York, of Durham, and Winchester. These have to be represented. You have 92 hereditary peers, and you have the other House of Lords peers who are now appointed by the king, in effect the government of the day. But what is interesting today is that you now no longer have a EU law here. So you have nothing technically in the way of any parliamentary legislation. It may, again, pass a bill of attainder saying, boil so and so, in theory. And interestingly enough, from the monarch being the center of all power, it shifts to the lords through the centuries, and finally in 1911 onwards has shifted to the commons. One interesting point Lord Bingham made was that at one point of time Parliament was considered sovereign because there was a distribution of power between 3 organs: monarch, lords, commons. That distribution has disappeared. Since 1707, the monarch, who theoretically has the right of veto, has never exercised it, and probably will never exercise it. The Lords, as we've seen after 1911, can only delay legislation, maximum now for 1 year. So it's an all-powerful Commons, therefore, that rules England today. We have to see how much further this sovereign aspect continues. And according to me, it will depend a lot upon the rationality of the law made. If an utterly irrational law is made, then perhaps we'll see Dr. Bonham's case coming back and judges saying that of course the common law will control such a thing. We don't have to wait for the next parliament. Thank you all very much.
Sharp memory to remember all the dates.
There's not one note in front of him.
Yeah.
This is incredible. What you've witnessed is truly marvelous. And the way